Yeah, get a picture as a puppy.
Oh my gosh. Look at that pupper.
You can eat my fingers now. You can eat my hand? Aren't you sweet?
He's the data guy and he wants to have a talk with his business pals while they're off the clock on podcast like a business.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Podcast Lab. Today we have the pleasure of having Marisa Banes. Marisa had the misfortune of working with me in the past. And actually, she was a data geek with me at a company we used to work at. And when I got to show her what's going on with the podcast, she's loved all the episodes and volunteered to be on. So I would love to share with the rest of you some other data jobs that are in the background that maybe you never even thought about. And Marisa's world comes from the call center industry. I know that I worked in the call center industry for years, and I think about how many things really go through a call center. I know at the call center we were at, the person who would sit there and wait for a call might have to pick up a poison control call, then hang up immediately and have to pick up a stuck elevator, then hang up immediately, and another call would come in about turtle wax. And so those call center agents have to be really, really skilled, but people who do what Marisa does, writes the code on the back end so that when the call comes in, they're actually looking and working well in their system and actually getting the person out of the elevator or, handling the poison control. So it's people like Marisa that nobody even knows exist that I wanted her to just come and share what that job is, how she helps people, and just your story in general, Marisa.
Wow,
Welcome.
Thanks for that. Yes, thanks for having me. It's kind of neat to see myself that way. I mean, I guess I do see myself that way. But yeah, there are all sorts of calls that you can end up taking in a commercial call center. And oh my, there are all sorts of call centers. And I actually started out answering the calls. I didn't even know what an answering service was. I always kind of describe it as, when you call your doctor's office at 3 a.m, there probably isn't somebody sitting in the doctor's office waiting for your call. It's probably somebody somewhere else taking all sorts of calls. Or if you're calling a lawyer or something in the middle of the night. Actually, what's kind of nice about commercial is it tends to not involve life and death. More recently, I've worked in healthcare call centers, and it's kind of scary because sometimes that actually does involve life and death. But so yeah, I started out on the phones, which I think is kind of cool because that gives me that background of knowing what they're going through. And I think that has increased my respect. I mean, anybody who can take calls for years and years, it is not an easy job, especially when you're answering all sorts of different calls.
Yeah, I don't know if you know this about me, Marisa, but actually my first job, I got my degree in business administration, and my first job, a neighbor recommended me to a call center. I actually took credit apps for Snap-on Tools. I'd answer 100 to 120 credit apps a day, and I would just, hello, what's your name? Put it in, run the credit, move on to the next. But yeah, man, it is another lifestyle. Like, you get out of that. Like, I would go home at the end of the day and just sit in quiet. Like, I didn't want to watch TV. I didn't want to listen to things or talk to people. I was like, whew. It's a high stress job. And I mean, it's all over. Like, you call about your bank, you call about anything you need help with. Chances are you're going to a call center nowadays, right? Like,
That idea is wild to me. Just because, like, I don't know, maybe it was a stereotype for my generation, but call center work was like if you don't go to college, you're going to be a garbage man of the tech world when I was coming up. So a lot of people were calling it the low level work. So to hear that they're not doing it for one business, they're doing it for multiple, and you're running through 100 customers, and the amount of even just stress, much less skills in both customer service and I'm sure learning software and data entry and understanding that data, it's just wild that there's such a negative perception of call center work when really there's a lot that sounds like it goes into it.
And I think it's starting to turn around. I think we are noticing people like call centers again. Like, I was trying to cancel. I had some internet I got through a third party. I tried to cancel them and I couldn't. I called I sent an email. They said, go to the website. I went to the website. It said, call this other number. It gave me an email that went to another number. It was just circles. I was like, give me a person. I was like, even if it's a call center, give me a person so I know that this is an actual company. It sets that apart. And it's way cheaper than having like people on staff answering all your phone calls and questions. You need them doing whatever you're paying them to do. So I think it's one of those things where like, we also noticed it, Marisa, you saw this too, especially in the call center world where we were dealing with medical calls. a lot of it was ages. So like certain like boomers and people who were 40s and 50s really like the phone call. People between 30s and 40s kind of like text and online. So, there's a little bit of that. But I think there's a personal aspect to the call center that, I don't know, I feel better with.
And I think maybe that's it too, is that we're coming back to a point where everybody is tired of dealing with robots. It's no longer the new fad, like the thing that everybody's doing. Everybody wants to go back to that human interaction. So maybe that is the perspective switch. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And I mean, what's crazy too, like you didn't think a call center would be necessarily a target job. I bet you didn't think at all that programming for a call center would be a target job. Like you probably didn't even know a job like Marissa's existed, where somebody who, I'm going to say just a person taking phone calls, no real programming background, but you're able to say, hey, I know how these calls are going. I know how I need to have stuff pop on the screen so I can fill it out. Let me go ahead and tweak the back end. Let's talk about how you transitioned, Marisa, before we get into all these questions, because I think there's other people who are going through changes just like what you're going through, right? Who like maybe they didn't like the call center. They're like, I have a little technical aptitude. How do I leverage that?
Right. And I had a college degree. I had my bachelor's of music and performance. I was just kind of, I guess I was between things and unsure what to do. And I needed a job. So as I got to learning, I guess I got more into learning about the job, and I was always interested in like learning more things. I remember one of the things that happened early on is, so we had these two offices that were connected via internet. So the two offices worked together as one. And so you had the people that take the calls, and then we had the people that dispatch the calls. Not all call centers are like that. That's how this one was. And the person in the office I was in, that was like the main office, the other was kind of like a satellite. So the person in the office that I was in, they could dispatch the calls, went home sick, but there's somebody in the other office who could. Well, it was at the end, I was working 4 10-hour shifts at the time. And my daughter was maybe, I don't know, maybe a year old or so. And I was just finishing up my 10-hour shift when the internet went down. And all of a sudden, we only had my office. We didn't have a satellite office. So there are 3 people in mine, and I was the most junior of the 3 of us. And I didn't even know how to like put a call like on repeat, like, which is where you put it back, like you put it in a queue so it can come back to you, so you don't lose the message in it, And I called my mom and said, because she had my kid, and I'm like, hey, I'm not going to be home for a while. I mean, I'm sure I could have said, bye, see ya, good luck. I couldn't do that. So then, I called the operations manager who, being an operations manager, especially then, she is the on-call person, something happened at 3 a.m., even with IT at that point, she would have to come in. So I called her and told her, and she called one of the other supervisors from the other office to drive the hour down. So when the manager came into the office, she asked me, have you ever dispatched calls before? Because usually they train you first. And I'm like, no, I haven't. She said, well, okay. So what I want you to do is I want you to read the instructions, do the best you can. If you're completely lost, go ahead and send the call to me. So that was my first time dispatching. And
nothing
that
like
was
trial by fire.
Right? I was thankfully I was excited.
Well, I mean, and that's that mindset that helped you succeed at this instead of just like hating your job and finding a new one the next day. Like, thank God you had that mindset going into it.
Right. I'm like, somebody has to do something, so I told everybody else, how to park the calls, how to just, do what we could to keep it going. And I think I stayed an extra 2 hours, and then finally, and that probably helped too when I went to become like a team leader, just like front end supervisor. But, and back in those days, a little over a decade ago, it was cool because things weren't as specialized. Like, I know after a while, team leaders didn't learn as much, but I got to learn about some of the programming for Infinity, which is the old version of the call software. So I got to learn some of that basic setup, and she encouraged me to look through the report. Don't be afraid to look through and figure things out. And a little while after doing that, I think is when I found out about the scripting. So Amtelco is like the company, Cisco is the one everybody's heard of. If you've heard of call center stuff, you've probably heard of Cisco Unify.
Yeah, there's like 4 main big ones that I know we dealt with that covered, I mean, it's got to cover like 80-90%. I know we had like Cisco, we had Amtelco, we had StarTel. And I know to people not in the call center industry, these may sound like crazy names, But like these three companies probably handle 70-80% of all the call centers. I mean, like the same work gets done. It's just a matter of who the client is at the call center. Is it medical? Is it commercial? Is it whatever? And they're all trying to use the similar pick up this phone and give it to somebody software that you help integrate. But yeah, they're not perfect, are they?
I remember one of the clients was a veterinarian that handled, companion animals a lot, but they also handled some of the large, farm animals, horses. And I remember during the third shift, I always worked first shift, so I heard about it after. But one evening during third shift, there was somebody who had called in with a mare that was pregnant. I think it was a brood mare that was pregnant or something. And
wow.
I forget if the baby died or but the horse, I think, ended up dying. But the person who was taking those calls, a lot of times third shift, you're by yourself. And the scripting was not set up for what do you do if somebody is calling in from this other vet that's saying that their horse is dying, or that it wasn't, you couldn't set it up. It wasn't set up for that scenario. So she actually had to go and figure it out and do her best. And thankfully the customer, the client was understanding. I mean, and obviously we were sad. You don't want anybody or anything to die. Usually it's not a matter of life and death. Usually, thankfully. I think I might have been doing the scripting at that point. Yeah, I think I did, because I think I actually set up that script that failed.
Yeah.
Not failed, but I mean, I guess it failed, but it was a good lesson for me too, maybe. Like, you can't predict everything.
You cannot, man. I'll tell you, like, I write code and you have a case statement that has a bunch of different things you're expecting and then else. And I mean, at some point it's going to hit that else statement, right? Like, you can't account for everything. It's just impossible.
And then you have apartment clients that'll have, sometimes dogs are left in apartments. I mean, I don't know how often that happens. I hope not too often. Usually you have all these criteria for if you're going to reach on the call or not. And the client was actually upset when we reached them over this dog being left in the apartment and barking. Like, I don't think it was like it had been left for 5 minutes. I think it was
over 4 hours or whatever.
Yeah. But the manager really, she supported what her agents decided to do. She's like, this is what we should have done. We should have reached. The fact that they didn't want to be reached on it, because you don't know, because it can damage the property. It can, it's not good for the dog. It's not good for the property. It's fun to, I don't know, especially once you get more into the graphical, like in the old format, you had like the basic message where you like filled out each of the fields. It was, almost like if you just had a piece of paper with different questions on it and you filled it out. But then the scripting, we had the scripting that was more dynamic, that depending on what you answered to one question, it drove another. Some of those things with like the apartment complexes and stuff got fun too, because like everything you count as an emergency.
Oh, exactly. And I mean, like, some properties may think it's an emergency and another property doesn't, right? So then you got like a new person who comes on and says, we want to do the same thing that you do for other property managers, and you do it. And then you announce, you notify them of something they don't want to be notified, or don't notify them of something you do. I honestly don't think people know how to go to call centers and have them help. Like, I don't think they realize there's somebody like you to help program the logic, like that the business can just go to the call center and say, this is the business logic. Do you have somebody to make sure that gets to your call center people? You know what I mean? And you do. Mm-hmm. You guys had some advanced screen pops where they had to know, click here, and if you fill out this, then other things would hide or show. And it really changes the options the person on the other end of the phone can do. I know one of the companies we were comparing before when we were, this project you and I worked on together was basically 40 different companies from 20 different acquisitions that came into one. And they're just like, hey, we're going to have one report. How hard is this going to be, right? So you and I got to just make it work. But there were a lot of nuances in terms of like, how are we going to do this? What do we want to do? I know Comcast was one that they kept bringing up and talking about, because Comcast in their call centers, it's a captive call center. They don't, we didn't do their work, but they would make it where if you called in, the agent could only have like, let's say 2 options. But if you called in 3 different times within the same so many hours within a week, then the agent would have a third option now to give you a higher amount of money back. But had you not made those 3 phone calls in and they didn't see in the logs that you called in and asked for help because you were mad, they wouldn't even give that kind of option to their agents. So, I mean, there's a lot of that stuff that goes on that I don't think people have any idea about. You know what I mean? They call in and they just yell at the call center guy and then hang up. Right. But usually you want to work with them because they want to get you the right solution,
I wonder if that was me or not, but I know I've had things like that where, like, if you have people with, like, you might have, like, an internet company that has, if you have so many calls in a period of time. And what's cool is with Amtelco's stuff is that you can have stored procedures with SQL. So you can actually have that set up. So it can go and look and it can count those, and which is cool because that exposed me to SQL.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, you guys do a lot.
That's how I came to data.
Speaking of how you came to data, look at that transition. You said you had gotten a degree, but that was absolutely nothing like the field that you're working in now. So was there a moment where it clicked that everything was data and that was the direction you wanted to go with your career?
I remember the first time I saw SQL. I had a script where I think I wanted to be able to, like, I might have been searching like apartment addresses or something like that. And so we needed the SQL to be able to like search the data more dynamically. So I worked with Rebecca Littleton on it. Like, I remember using like Radman, and so when she helped me with make this stored procedure, I actually got to watch her do it. Like, I just remember seeing that, and I was just like, wow, this is awesome. Maybe it was really cool just seeing too what that data could do on the back end.
I loved her, actually. She was great. She used to work for me, and she worked remote. I remember she would always just work from home from her kitchen, and she loved SQL just as much as you, and she loved sharing it with the people who were like you, would really leverage it. Like, you're taking that knowledge, and then now you're bringing it to the front-end call center rep. And to your point with that one, they're able to do more addresses. Like, the service we were able to offer got better because you were willing to take on that additional skill of, hey, I'll learn SQL. How hard can it be?
I just couldn't resist. I mean, it was just so interesting to me.
What parts?
I didn't know what I really started with was like the SQL queries. Like, I remember sneaking in and kind of, I wasn't sure exactly what I was like allowed to do or not, but I would go and I would start doing select queries, and I would start I got really good at, looking without breaking anything, without doing too much.
Sure.
I guess I had some exposure to Access because my team actually, we would save things through the scripting to the table. So I guess we did some basic table setup, but we didn't do any select queries. We really didn't use Microsoft SQL Server Studio. I mean, I know Access you can use, Microsoft Access you can use. It's not the same. And it's probably a lot easier to use Access without ever touching those. and then after a while, one of the sites was in Chicago, and they used SQL more. And so I got some exposure to that through their programmer there too. And a little bit through Sean.
Yeah.
Sean was such a grouch. He's always too busy and always too. But maybe it was good because, he didn't want to spoon feed me too much. He seemed to think that I don't know, maybe he believed I could figure stuff out. I know I was more savvy about it than some of my teammates.
He used to report to me too. I wonder if he and Rebecca worked out that he would give Rebecca to you, and then he would go work on the other stuff. I know they were trying to divide and conquer constantly because, to your point, there were a lot of offices that were big data users. And when you take 40 offices and say you're now supported by these 4 people, there's a lot of questions, right? And everything in the call center is data, like how the call gets routed, what number it called from, who it got sent to, who it stopped along the way. We would look at they call it like, not the trunk, what do they call that? Every call segment, like call came in, went on hold, was on hold for like seconds.
All of the call states and the times, and if it was highlighted time or unhighlighted or selected, basically if it was on an agent's screen or if it wasn't at the time.
And I remember we had like big conversations around like what KPIs even matter. Because when you have 20 different companies, we had some that said, oh, we need our magic number. Remember that whole thing? And then other ones that are like, oh, we're getting rid of the magic number. We're going to use this. And so that was like an emotional shift. It was data related, but it was more of a, can we even run the same way these other people are running? We've been running the way we've been running forever. Does that data represent us? Did you get hit with that at all?
I don't think I did so much where we work together. I've gotten to do more since. The company I actually ended up leaving for, when I told them I was interested in reporting, they use something called SciSense for their dashboards, which is like it's like BI as a service, I guess. It's Tableau-ish.
Yeah, Tableau Lite is what I kind of call it.
But they do have, and then they have the interface in between of what pulls the data from the different sources and manipulates it for the dashboards to pull from.
Oh, good. Okay.
So it does have that aspect of it. And I hadn't worked with it before. And I haven't had the chance to work with Tableau or Power BI. Like I've seen them, I know about them. But I was able to, kind of step in and take over that piece. I remember one thing I got a request for that I was working on. The person that was like doing the setup for it, he was doing it as consulting work. He was the brother of the president of the company. And, so this is what he had been maintaining. So they were kind of excited thinking of, somebody in-house. I'm sure in-house and cheaper, do that. Right. And and then I realized I needed, some help with it. And I remember I was waiting on this guy, to have time, to help me. And then I was like, you know what? If I really want to be able to do this stuff, I want to see if I can figure it out myself. Thanks to impatience and curiosity and stubbornness, I went and looked through the documentation that was offered and found something that walked me through it so that by the time he was able to help me, I basically said, hey, can you go check this and see if I did it right? So that was exciting for me.
Hashtag how it's done there, Marisa.
Yep. And I had to ask for like more access too, because, I had to push management for more access because I'm like, okay, so I actually need this access to be able to do this.
And I bet they didn't mind as long as you could justify and say, hey, here's what I'm doing. I would like to do this. I just need to know a little bit more about X, Y, and Z or access to X, Y, and Z. And they're like, oh, that makes sense. Talk to Jim in accounting or in IT or whatever, right? I
had to push just a little bit and I guess they trusted me enough to go ahead and say, fine, and give me that. And one of the things I got to do with that actually was with call center metrics and it's with the query on the back end, the stored procedure on the back end that was pulling that data. But there were all sorts of joins and it was pulling from like all those MTelco tables on the back end. And I think I found somewhere where like it was pulling some of the information from a wrong table. There are like two tables with like the agent information. There's one with like the active agents, and then there's one with all the agents, like historical and present, or else you're going to, once they're no longer active, you lose that. And I realized that they were missing that. So I went through this guy's big, long query. And thankfully I had, my programming-ish background because I saved a copy of the query before I did anything because I'm just used to that with scripting. Sometimes you really think for yourself when you save a script so you can, if stuff happens and you're surprised, you can roll back. This might be I wonder if it could be where data burned me. I don't know. So I updated the query and I had to figure out, okay, how do I get this information that I need from the table? I updated, I ran it, it seemed to work. And then a little while later, I find out that the server's lagging. And it's so funny because I guess I tend to like be guilty or like, I don't know. I tend to worry that I did stuff. And I told the IT guy, no, this time I think it really was me. So I rolled it back and that, fixed the lag.
Yeah,
nothing like dragging down a production server.
Dude, I deleted an entire table once in production. And I mean, you go home and you just pray different. And then you really hope backups work and you never do it again is how it works. But I'll tell you, it happened.
Those are some powerful lessons, aren't they?
They are. And I mean, you could practice all you want to say you're never going to do it. It's never going to happen to you. Put the hours in the chair and it'll eventually happen. I mean, when I did that, I had a whole statement that said delete from where, and then there was a semicolon after the from. And so all of a sudden it just deleted the whole table. And it was like, you're talking 20 years ago when I did something that's stupid, but I never forgot it.
Begin transaction is awesome.
Oh, yeah. So I already had auto commit on. And I mean, like when I'm in SQL, I usually am in SQL doing data modeling. Like the vast majority of the stuff I'm in there is I'm like, okay, so for example, for that call center, we had 4 different softwares. Well, they didn't all have the same table structure, right? And Telco's data is different than Cisco's data, is different than Infinity, is different than all those. So I had to like create one model that would work. And that was my destination table. And so then I had to write the extract, transform, and load that would pull from any one of those, whatever server it was, and drop it with the same key. So it would always have an agent ID.
Tables are weird.
Oh, dude, it was a lot of mental gymnastics to try to say, how do I have 50 offices sync concurrently to one server when their data is all different? But once that table was built and the modeling was all done, that's what the reports you're able to just build off of, because there was one large table of all the agents, no matter what office, no matter what acquisition, no matter what software they were on. You could do the metrics on them. But man, it was a bear, because you have to find those commonalities that work with everybody. And really, when it comes to call centers, they all track the same data for a period of time, how much of it was active versus inactive versus, auxed out. They want to know that per person. They want to know everything about a call in the different parts. And then in aggregate, like how many times was each call on hold, or did they not get picked up, or, redirect on no answer? Remember RONAs? Oh my God, all that stuff. Those were things I would have to watch for, and I would get dinged with when I was getting calls. But also, I know Michelle, if you remember Michelle, she was looking for stuff like that too. And Michelle's job was a VP who basically they said to her, Michelle, come up with one report for everybody. And she just went to Rob and said, Rob, come up with one report for everybody. And then I had to go to people like, Marisa and say, hey, I'm sure there's 9 things out of 10 on your report that works great. I would love to know those, and I would love to know the one you don't. And I would do that at all the different companies. And I would kind of come up with one report that hopefully fit most of it. But what's crazy is like the programming you're doing is a whole different database. Like the database I'm talking about is just call centers, the metrics of the calls, the metrics of the people. But you would write an entire different like set of tables that would track whatever the client needed to track. You would have to go in and have like the client say, hey, we need to know X, Y, and Z every time somebody calls in. And you would write custom tables, and you would be writing all that stuff. And then that involves special reporting on just those tables, because you'd have to report back to the customer how many calls in and how did the agent answer. So what's funny is we both worked on the same stuff, but we worked on completely different sets of data most of the time. It was wild.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, and you had to be really sure, like to say that key. It's really annoying too, is that UCN, when Amtelco upgraded to Genesis, they changed it to call ID.
And so I lost hours of sleep over that, because I had like 20 servers that were all Amtelco that all had the same IDs. They were all overlapping, right?
Yeah, because I was just thinking about that actually, because you would have those. I was thinking about that, how you would have all these same numbers. So I was like wondering, my mind is like going, I'm like, so what do you do when you pull it in? Do you like generate something so you can differentiate those so they can still be unique across? I don't know if you use like a squid or whatever.
Yeah, on my ETL. So what I did is, let's say I brought over call ID 1 from Chicago. I had surrogate keys. So I would have a join key. So the key wasn't just the call ID. It would be what server did it come from and what ID is it. So I would never have a duplicate of the same server have the same ID.
Right.
And then I would have a table that said these servers are all inside of this office. So now I knew what calls went to what office. Because I mean,
nice.
It was a cloud call center. We didn't have physical areas. We had a lot of different servers in the cloud at different places, right? It was a wild time to be managing all that.
And what's funny is the last place I was, they weren't, I don't get it. It frustrates me because they have like a whole BI department, but they aren't using it for their call center.
Drives you crazy, doesn't it?
Well, actually, one thing that was interesting is there's some custom information I wanted to save from the tables.
Sure.
Amtelco has like that database connection that you can make between the scripting and the tables. Well, to be able to use that, somebody has to set that up. You have to have a login, that the scripts can use, and you have to know what that information is.
Right.
And I could not figure out how to get that from anybody.
Oh, no.
So what I did is, my mind worked on this for a while because I was stubborn. I really wanted it. And I don't think I could have gotten access to be allowed to make custom tables anyway. So I don't know if you remember, but like in the scripting, they have all these different types of fields. One of them is call fields. So when a call comes in, if you change scripts or whatever, those call fields stay the same because they're attached to the call they come in on.
Sure.
So they save somewhere. There's a call fields table.
Yep.
So I figured out that I could actually use the call fields table, save my custom information to that table. And then since I had read access, I could go ahead and pull that data.
Oh.
I felt really happy when I figured that out.
Well, yeah, because now the manual stuff you were doing is automated. It's in a system, like a real computer system, right? It feels like, important.
Now, if I'd had access to DB Mail or been able to have somebody turn that into a dashboard or something, that would be nice. But when I left where I happened to be at the time, I showed somebody else, so it might still be able to be used.
I love that. That's the hard part of this, right? Like, I know the stuff you and I built, they sold to another company, and they actually took my developer with. Sean went with them. So he's still maintaining it. So whatever we built, he's still keeping alive and running. But you never know if that happens at some places. And, some places I check in on and they've migrated to something new. Some places you're like, How are you still on that? It's been 6 years. Like, that was a 1-year solution. Like, how did you not do something better by then? But it's hard, right? Like, because you're doing consulting now too. So you're doing project-based work and stuff like that. And it's hard to go into a customer and say, hey, I'm going to do this project, but you've got a timeline. Eventually, we got to walk out the door. You know, we can't stay there and babysit them forever.
Although I'm kind of on the beginning end of that, I'm still kind of getting used to like seeing myself like as a consultant. But I like it that I can come in and provide that subject matter.
I'm still not used to it. I've been doing it for 4 or 5 years now. So I'll let you know. I'll let you know if I get used to it. But it feels weird when you go in there like, well, how do you normally fix these problems? And you're like, what do you mean? Like, what's your problem? Because they're all different. Depending on what your problem is, will dictate how I approach it. You know, like.
Well, the vendor said they could do this for us. I'm like, well, I don't know how they're going to do it. It's been a good learning experience that I actually do kind of hope to stay in. I have that need to be entertained.
Me too.
Which is why I met you, because I was kind of hoping to be able to like get into the BI end of things, and you know I didn't at the time, but I still got to exploit some of what I knew.
Hey, we're happy to help you get in there now. So you let me know what else you feel like you're missing, and we're doing it. I'm actually doing a whole thing right now, and I mean you'll see more coming out on this channel and the other ones. I want to solve the employment gap. I know that sounds like a big, hairy, audacious goal, but I feel companies list a bunch of roles, and these roles come out with knowledge, skills, and abilities. And then there's all these people who want these jobs, like data scientist is one I have on my board that I just looked up. There were 19,000 jobs open, over $100,000 a year. 19,000 jobs. That's not small. So why wouldn't people apply for those, right? They don't like money? No, they don't think they can do it. They don't think they have stats. They don't think they have business. They don't think they have the soft skills or whatever it is. So if I can go through and look at the different data scientists, this is just one example, titles, and say, what are the 9 things they have in common? And what are the 3 things you might need to be a marketing data scientist versus an operational data scientist or whatever? Then I can highlight for people, what are the 4 or 5 skills they're missing? Like your stuff, if I would say like a BI developer, I think you have all those skills. There's really nothing I think you may not have the fluency with the BI tools themselves yet, but I don't know if it's worth just like taking a class on those tools and just being like, well, I've taken a class on Power BI and now I know. It's more like finding a project that you're passionate about to build something in Power BI, maybe even related to a call center of some kind, right? Like maybe we can find some old call center data and learning that way to just build that one, hey, now I also have Power BI and I've read SQL and statements and all that stuff. It's the combination of those things that really helps, set you apart. I think your curiosity and those skills you don't count very much are really your differentiators. I think those are fantastic things for you.
One thing I helped with your team was with the email parsing.
Oh my gosh.
I think Rebecca was actually probably pretty happy with that when I figured out that I'm pretty sure I was the one who, in conjunction with her help, figured out that we could have like a generic procedure for that. And so I helped kind of spearhead like having that, because we were like doing a stored procedure for like each time we had to have these emails come in and take the bits of information out. Of course, now MTelco has some better ways, and it's gotten easier to do, and it's done differently.
Always will, right?
I mean, it's gotten, I think it can actually exploit XML with that too now.
Uh-huh.
So, and I did some of the custom procedures. I never did stored procedures before I worked at the answers. Like I said, the first time I saw SQL was with them.
Honestly, just hearing you talk with the fluency you have about these topics, what did you say your degree was in?
Music.
Oh, I don't think they taught stored procedures much in music or general querying at all. So, I mean, this is your curiosity and your willingness to learn on the job just shining through. It's fantastic to see.
Thank you. I mean, I took a little bit of the scenic route. There was a brief time I was almost in a major that would have made more sense, but it didn't work out. I tried to do some sort of business information thing. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I didn't learn anything about SQL. I didn't get into, I think I took a little bit of I can't remember if it was C# or C+. Probably C+.
I don't know if I even took SQL. So here's what happened. So I took business administration. I was not a programming degree, but they had like you're saying, it was called OMIS, Operational Management and Informational Systems, which is a business degree with a little bit of SQL and coding. Well, I didn't take that, but I was really poor in college. So I just got a job in the computer lab where I would help with printers and help people with Excel. And I sat through a couple of those classes. So I would just sit on the computer and follow along and like learn SQL while they were just, you go to the shared drive, you download the free SQL, you just copy it. And I remember the teacher like walking around the room, checking everybody. And he got to my desk and he's like, "You're not allowed to do that. You can't just copy me. You have to take the class if you want to do that." And I'm like, no, I don't want to take the class. I just work here every Tuesday anyway. So I'm just going to follow along and not turn anything in. I just want to pick up what I can about SQL. You know what I mean? I'm not one of these real programmer guys. I just want to know what it is. And I'll tell you, 5 years later, I was writing SQL at a job just by chance, and I did not expect to be. But it's just that I'm willing to go learn the vernacular. I'm willing to learn the words. I'm willing to learn what is a stored procedure versus a query versus all that stuff, right? It sounds crazy to people who've never heard it before.
And I think w3schools.com is probably where I started. There's a past data community. I don't know if you've ever been in any of the past things, but I mean, I did some SQL Saturdays to start. I met Grant Fritchie, the scary DBA, who I found out from one of my jobs. I was such a fangirl when I met him. I was like, "Can I speak to him?" He was so touched. I mean, that I was like, acted like I was like meeting a celebrity.
Well, you said you recommended Brett Ozar. I mean, I've been following that guy for 15 years. You know what I mean? So I'd kind of,
So if you met him, you'd be geeking out too.
Yeah, that's okay. I still do that. With people.
I don't know. Is this proof that I
love it? I love when we got the reference material.
After I dragged the server down.
Hey man, that's how you learn.
and I actually have read bits of this book and some other. And I did study for one of the SQL certifications. I don't know if it was Microsoft SQL Server 2014. It's like 2 exams. And I was working on the first exam and I got a thing where I could like retest. And I was just trying to kind of push myself. So I just went ahead and scheduled the first test. I'm like, this will just be a practice run. I'll just go down and see where I'm at. And partway through the test, I'm thinking, okay, I'm done. I'm ready to just, okay, I know enough about this test. I'm ready to but I went ahead and finished it and I passed it.
Nice.
Hey.
And don't get me wrong, I had studied for it, but I didn't think I was done studying.
Yeah.
And then I thought, this test
awesome.
is stupid. Like, why did I pass it?
Yeah. No, I'd love to chat with you more too about like where you learned and what kind of, because the thing I want to try to give people is help fill in those KSAs they're missing. But what I'm realizing is not everybody's down to take a course. Not everybody wants to spend 5 or 10 hours learning what they need to learn. A lot of people maybe like this, they want to listen to a podcast and just get some general awareness and they'll go, to your point, W3 schools or something else. Or maybe they want to take like an hour-long video and get like a little cert they can put on their LinkedIn. But I'd love to know, like, which do you feel was actually the stuff that helped you learn? Which do you feel like you were doing more for like your resume? That kind of stuff.
I think studying for that Microsoft cert, although there's a database fundamentals one that I got first, I think that was through a SQL Saturday talking to somebody. And they said, when they're looking through resumes, sometimes, seeing somebody who actually, has at least a cert that shows, that they had that proactive, that can make the difference, that a lot of people don't have that. Mm-hmm. And I think I talked to one of the data people and I realized that fundamentals one, I'm like, that would probably be pretty easy for me to just, be able to pick up. So I think I studied just a little bit and then I picked that one up. And that probably is what pushed me to go ahead and study some more for the other one.
But you like that feeling of getting those certs along the way, huh?
I think it helped guide my study. Although over time, the Microsoft certification it's changed even more. It changed some. I think one of the things about the first exam too is that I think they split things up a little differently so that there's some stuff that wasn't on the first exam anymore.
It actually looks like that Microsoft Database Fundamentals exam was retired in June of 2022. They do not offer it anymore.
Oh, no. Sounds like we'll have to make one.
Yeah, and that 2014 server one is gone. Yeah, they changed how they did their roles and stuff.
And they always do. I mean, so the guy I was just talking to before this call, actually, he teaches certification for the PMP certificate, if you know that, Project Management Professional. And it's the same thing. Like they had a whole training program that PMI put out, the people who host that certificate, and they wanted teachers to pay $7,500 a year to be certified, and then they could only use their material to teach it. And it just doesn't give the same result as letting somebody who's an expert in it teach their stuff. You know what I mean? And I think Microsoft struggles too, because they don't know how to get the same information as the servers change and as people get new jobs.
This is the one that I took and passed, and I did use this book a bit.
Yep.
So they're training.
But you know what? The same thing I told that guy is I've never had my PMP certification. I did read the books though, 20 years ago, and it hasn't changed too much. Just like the stuff in there. Yes, there's syntax things that'll change with the server, right? But the majority of it isn't. I mean, you're still going to have select from where.
If anybody wants an early book, I like this one. So this one's more basic. I think I learned some about my joins in here too, and some of the other RDBMSs, the relational database management systems.
I have that exact.
Now you got me grabbing books. Hold on. Now you got me curious.
I have that exact book. My databases course in university taught out of that book.
Oh, so I chose a good one, huh?
Yeah, it was good for the fundamentals. That was actually one of the things I wanted to talk to you about because you didn't go to school for this, I guess. I went to school as a programmer and I felt that it didn't teach the fundamentals. I felt like every single assignment didn't build on the last one. And by the time I had my degree, I felt lost as hell. Like I was completely lost. I didn't know how to program to save my life. And I had spent 4 years and $100,000 learning how to program.
Oh, wow.
And I went to Northern Illinois University and I did not feel like that program worked. And then I got this job. Luckily, I was interning because I also got a business and marketing double minor. And I learned more working for this marketing company in the first 6 months than I did in my 4-year degree. And it was really frustrating. It was a really frustrating experience to not feel like I could translate all of that time and what I was supposed to be learning. And I guess I wanted to ask you what your learning process was like. Was it easier because you learned hands-on right away on the job? Did you feel like there were other problems that you had to take home and teach yourself? Was there a steep learning curve for you, or did it all kind of just fall together?
I don't know. A bit of a steep learning curve, maybe. Some of it I definitely learned learned by doing, and going online and searching for stuff. I have definitely taken advantage of being able to look on the internet for things, because you can look up questions that other people have asked.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like for one job, they were working on PCI compliance. And so for part of PCI compliance, it was also this thing where they had acquired other offices. So they had offices that have been around for, 20 years, and it used to be cool back in the day to collect credit card numbers and not be very, very careful with them.
Yeah.
And for PCI compliance, they don't like you to have those laying around. So I was, they kind of asked me if I thought I could do this and, gave me the chance to try. So I did go clean up these credit card numbers out of these tables. I'd never done, anything like that before. And for that, I know I looked up a lot, I looked up how to look up the metadata, because I didn't want to go into each table and find each one. That would have just taken me my whole life.
Right.
So I did the stored. I think I got it down to where I had to run the stored procedure on each database at the database level, but I didn't have to run it on the table. And then I had to show my work. And I was really kind of happy when, when I showed my work and they were like, okay, that's good enough. I expected it to come back to me. It was like the practice test. I figured, that I figured I'd get feedback and then I'd go back and, but it was good enough. I don't know. I think I sort of picked it up as I went along and just suffering and wondering, how do I learn this stuff? And it took a long time for me to feel like I actually did know a bit. Sitting on those SQL Saturday classes or the seminars, I just remember sitting there feeling hey, one of the other questions, imposter syndrome. I'm I don't really belong here. I was, maybe I was you sitting in that class, Rob, and just sort of, and I have ADHD. I would sit through this, even the ones that I didn't know much about. And I was just, I don't know why. I was just fascinated and paying attention, in a class learning about disaster recovery.
I think Ryan and I are both non-diagnosed ADHD too. It's the constant new stuff going on. I got to be looking for, new ways to help. I get bored if I'm doing the same thing over and over again.
I chase dopamine to an unhealthy level. It's honestly a problem.
At least you admit it.
Actually, one reason I'm glad that I moved on from the one job I was at is I think they would have removed any access I had to SQL. Because weren't they in the process of locking that down, Rob? And that was, I don't think I would have had that access.
It's one of those blessings
longer.
And curses, right? You want the people involved that can weigh in on it, but too many cooks in the kitchen, really makes a bad dish. And so you get people in there updating and changing tables or saying, we really need this added or that. So yeah, I mean, you generally want to have this phase where you're building out what you need and you get everybody involved, and then you lock it down to only the people you need to have access to. So like most end users only get read access generally to certain queries that are like pre-written. So somebody like you and I who like to have read access to whatever we want and write access to specific things if we need to gives people heart attacks. Not that it can't be done. And honestly, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll build a server on my laptop or desktop of whatever company I'm at. And then once the system's working and I can prove it, I'll promote that to production so that I'm not touching that. But I can beat up my own computer and server all I want because then I'm not worried about breaking anything, you know?
Oh, yeah. The thing with that PCI compliance, it was really nice is I was told that because I was worried about that whole, dragging the server down.
Mm-hmm. Rightfully so.
Yeah. Right. Because, yeah. I mean, especially when you're doing queries that are complicated that you haven't really done before, you don't know how long they're going to take.
And that's the thing. I don't think people on this, we've never talked about SQL on this show. So like what people don't realize when you're doing a query, you're basically saying, hey, millions of records, we want to look for the 40 we care about. And we're going to look for them based on this criteria, either the number or maybe like you're looking at a specific word in a memo field. And each thing you kind of look for determines how fast it's going to be returned to you. If you have a really efficient table and you know you're only going to look for IDs, you're going to index all those IDs and they're going to be pulled back really quick. But some of the stuff that Marisa would have to do would be like, see if people mentioned the word the in the memo. And I mean, servers are not generally indexing every possible word that's in the memo field. So what happens is it could lock and the whole server would then say, hey, pause everybody. We got to get Marisa the stuff she wants back. And when she gets that back, then the server will run again. And yeah, you make a lot of enemies real quick when you lock the entire server because you're trying to find, even if it's your job, even if it's what you're supposed to be looking for, it could definitely happen. And you and I have talked about ways to like get around that where you can put no locks and things like that on it. But there's pros and cons, right? You still have to eventually run the query and get the data you want back without destroying the business.
Right. Well, and the one I was telling you about with that agent table, it was a correlated subquery. Which I guess means that you have like an outside query and an inside query. And like, it's like every time you do run that inside query, it has to refer to the outside. So it's like you're doing the same thing over and over and over again. And if you have it do that with a lot of information, that gets very expensive. There's a cost of business. There's a cost in processor time. Right. And actually with that, I went ahead and I used the index so that I could actually it's almost like using the index in the back of a book so you can match stuff up.
Yep.
And, what's easier, looking through a whole book looking for a specific topic or looking in the index where somebody already said. So, yeah, I had it do the index and then I had it match up with the index, the information I wanted so that it was quicker. Oh, I love getting off on tangents and then I just totally forget where I was.
I'm happy to pick you up there. So I couldn't find the book I was looking for, but the books you were talking about are great for the developer. The stuff I started to do that transitioned me more into like the architect side is the Data Warehouse Toolkit by Ralph Kimball. And so basically, like, let's say we'll start back in the 80s. There weren't as big of databases as there are now. They just didn't use them. They used green paper that, had like squares on it, like this graph paper. But then they would go and they would just keep track of things manually. You didn't do a 4-year running analysis by product to figure out which product was most profitable. You just couldn't. So we started doing that and people were debating over the best way to build these tables so they didn't get locked like that. And it was basically between this guy Inman and this guy Kimball. And they each had their own. One was a star schema, one's a snowflake schema. I'm not going to get into all that today. But researching why different people wanted to store stuff different ways showed me that there's reasons for that, right? Generally, Kimball is the one who won out. It's the one I follow more often. But it teaches you to make these dimensions, these, like you said, the agent table. So I'm going to have a table of all the agents. Well, that way of thinking, I can translate to anything. I could do it in call centers. I could do it in operational management. It doesn't matter. But this is called data modeling or data warehousing. And it's like a whole subset inside of SQL. It's like, how do I want to take all this data and store it in a way that's easy to recall to the people who need to recall it? And I mean, that's what changed my entire career. And I did that when you and I were at the same company because they just said, hey, Rob, we need one report for this. Can you just make it all go to one table? And I was like, no, but somebody smart's done it before and I can go learn from him. Like I can go do that. And I did. And I just copied it. And in that book, the Data Warehouse Toolkit, they'll go by industry. They'll say telecommunications. These are the 10 tables that most people are trying to query because they care about these KPIs. For commercial real estate, these are what people care about. For retail, these are what people... We're not inventing the wheel, but we do have to know how to use the wheel correctly. You know, a lot of people get the wheel and lay it on the side and be like, I don't know, this thing's broken. And we're like, no, you need to hook it to a cart and it rolls the cart. And they're like, you're a wizard. But that's a whole nother skill, right? I bet you never even thought about looking into data modeling.
I don't know if I have specifically, or I guess not.
Nobody asks for it. Like, they expect you to do it, and they don't expect you to have to ask for it. Like, that's one thing where I've been on a lot of companies. I've said, I'm going to model this data out. And they're like, we don't have time for that. We need you to do it for real. And I'm like, no. The model isn't like a fake model like in a building where you build a small fake model and it's like to scale of the big one. A data model is you're building out the actual data, the way it's going to be used forever. And what's crazy is like my last client, I went in there and I said, hey, I like your reports. McKinsey was just in here. They helped you build these. Obviously, they're a big, management consulting company. They know how to do that. But I said, you've got duplicates. You're giving people duplicate credit. And they said, no, I'm not. And I said, on this date, you gave them credit. And then you gave them credit the next day and the next day for this serial number. I can show you. Here's another person. And the person who I showed that to is the head of operations. And she just kind of sat there like, there's no way. Like, am I lying? Is this data just wrong? And I said, no, it's really only happening about 3% of the time. It's non-material, but you'll never be able to figure out which ones are your best workers and which ones aren't because there's just noise in this data enough to where it's going to screw you up. And she said to me, she's like, well, Rob, that's not your concern. You're just an analyst. The BI team will handle that. They do all that to make sure there's no duplicates and to make sure that's all there. And I said, that's great. Let me double check with them and just make sure we're aligned. I talked to them and they said, no, that's on the business. That's the business's job because we don't know what duplicates are. It's up to them to tell us if it's a duplicate or not a duplicate, right? And this is at every company. There's this back and forth of who owns the data versus who owns the servers versus who owns the rules for the data versus all that stuff. And I mean, we get stuck in the middle.
So speaking of getting stuck in the middle, Marisa, if I can ask, what's your day-to-day look like? We've talked about a lot of your big projects. We talked about how you've gotten to where you're at now, but like, what do you work with every day? What are you doing on a daily basis? And if somebody else, now that they know what this scripting position is striving for your job or a job similar to it, what should they expect?
Sure. Well, actually, my last project did wrap up at the end of January. And what I was originally brought on for with that project was helping like with their directory because they're like consolidating all their like entities over to the telco like software, and they were having issues with like the directory and searching and stuff. But a lot of what I ended up actually helping with, I did work some on that, but a lot of what I ended up helping with was as a subject matter expert, because I knew more about scripting. I could say, hey, no, this is stuff we can do in house. We don't need the vendor for this, or some of like any reporting needs tended to be sent to me to use the built-in software. And sometimes I would, pull that raw data from the back end because I could, and then people would ask me, how they could run that. And I'm like, I'm really sorry, only I can do that.
So true.
I felt really, I felt bad for that. Some of it, was helping with some of the scripting. Some of it is like the on-call schedules, especially towards especially the second half. So a lot of it, is analyzing the business needs. Unofficially, I've done some of that business analyst role. You ask people like, how have they been doing the on-call? How have you been doing this already so that I can go ahead and translate that over and, and kind of show them what's possible. And, when I started out scripting for the answering service, I think at some point the duties were split out, but we would talk with the clients, the customers, the actual customers who were buying the service and gather what they needed and then go ahead and set up their scripting. Sometimes it involves setting up tables. So I know I'm going roundabout a lot. So some of it is, working.
But I mean,
with
that's hard, right? Like a lot of our jobs, they just hire for skill and they're like, your job is other duties as assigned. You know what I mean? They don't give you a clear, this is what you do. When you took calls, you sat down at a phone and you got calls. When you were dispatching, you sat down, you knew to dispatch. When we do what we do now, it's an ambiguous job, isn't it? It's a little bit weird.
It's getting more and more ambiguous. Yeah, this last time, if I had waited around all the time for somebody to tell me what to do, I wouldn't have been much use.
So do you try to do projects then and like identify like, hey, if I get this done, I can just work on that for the next week or two. And then I know at least this gets delivered, right? Like those kinds of, or is it just different every day?
Probably different every day. Or sometimes
depends on the client too,
some
right?
of it was the actual project of like, that I was helping with migrating them over. A lot of times those steps, were not the best defined. Of course, sometimes what was really fun too is I would get into that, find out that the right people hadn't been involved in the first place. Oh, that's always fun at the last minute to find all these people that they're like, oh, this is the first time I've ever heard of this. Like, okay, well, we go live in a couple weeks, so let's go ahead and work. That's always, or finding out that, somebody really wanted some historical data from before.
So, and I'll go back to what you said earlier about imposter syndrome. When you go in and you're doing all these things, and we're kind of just like a wizard, Harry, you know what I mean? We're kind of coming in and just being magic. How do you help combat that? I know, nobody's perfect at it. We're all kind of dealing with it in different ways and at different levels at different times. But anything you find that helps?
I wonder if one thing that helped is when I really embrace the idea that I do not have to know it all and I don't have to be good at everything. I know over the years I got better at like working on myself in my head and stuff.
Me too. It's a constant lesson, isn't it? I'll tell you.
But, there are times I've actually been grateful that there are people that are better at some things than I am. Or, when I think of, okay, so I don't know this bit of information, who can I ask? Who can I reach out to? And that's actually one of my strengths, I think, is that, I'm willing to think of people like on other teams. Sometimes the people I would ask for help from, were the people taking the calls. Maybe not at this last one, but at other jobs before. I don't know. I think in the last few years, I've gotten a lot more confident. I feel more like it's okay to say I'm like a data person. I mean, I still maybe say it 100%, but, that I do know more. And I come across people who know some, but don't know as much as I do. And maybe that helps.
Well, and you're not going out trying to build data warehouses either. You're going in and you're doing the stuff you're good at. You know what I mean? I think that helps you too, is you're sticking to what you're great at.
And I was like with that dashboard, like I was willing to just go ahead and jump in as much as they would let me. And I do realize that not everybody could just jump in and do that. I had seen crystal reports before. I had seen Power BI as like a theory, other people doing stuff.
Right. Which
is not the same as going in there, getting some access to be able to administer some of the stuff, and not the same thing.
Oh. But I mean, I'm glad you reached out and tried it. Like, that's part of it too, I think, is giving it a shot. There's a lot of people who just say, nope, that's not for me. I don't know that.
If it's something I'm interested in that I can't resist, I guess I'm willing to take some risks there. And actually, that job only lasted 4 months for like business reasons, nothing to do with me. And I'm still glad I took that leap.
I've had some like that too. My first contract was a 2-month contract that extended to the 3rd month. And I was like, holy cow, somebody actually paid my rate and wanted to keep me for 1 more month. And it felt awesome. Just like hearing like, I am actually good at what I do. You know what I mean? It's hard, even though it's only 90 days or 4 months, that's all they needed. That's the business need. And that's cool.
But the 14 months I just wrapped up started out as 6 months.
Yeah. I mean, that happens too, right? I was on one that I thought would be a 90-day contract and I was stuck there for 2 years because it was just 90-day contract and another 90-day contract and another 90-day contract, and pros and cons.
And I find that if I feel like, like I'm being treated, fairly, I'm cool with that. I think I kind of like that idea. I think I work better as like a specialized person, that sometimes it's worth it to pay me extra for the extra stuff that I can do, even if it means that you don't necessarily want to keep me for years and years. Because I know the job I had before that, I think one reason I was laid off was, that I don't know, if you're paying for more skills than you need, I get it.
Hey, man, I've been laid off 3 different times. And I swear each time was somebody somewhere in another state went into a room in a suit and they sorted descending by salary and just said, keep go, keep go, keep go. It wasn't anything I did. It wasn't anything the projects I was on. It was just, you got to cut headcount and people get cut. And at first, it's hard because you take it personally, even if they say it's not your fault. Because how do you not? The second or third time, you definitely take it personally because you're like, what? Is it just the 3rd time it's not my fault that this happened to me? But eventually you realize that it's not you, and it's because they don't know how to value what you're doing. They don't know how to take the skills you have and actually return revenue on them. You know what I mean? Like, if they have you looking at calls, that's great. If they have you looking at something that helps customers, that's nice. If they can show a way for you to look at data that improves their margin, they just paid to have you for another year. You know what I mean? And then they could position us to go look at pricing and start seeing other things that maybe increase the revenue instead of just try to cut costs. But it all comes down to that business's ability to really use somebody like us to generate that revenue. They'll hire it and they'll post the positions. They'll put a role that says, we need a programmer. but they don't really have any intention of you changing the company. They want you to. They're going to tell you they want you to. They're going to tell you they want somebody with experience to come and fix stuff. Just don't write anything to production. You know what I mean? And don't make any big waves. And you're like, but how am I going to change anything? So I hear you on that very much.
I know all of this stuff. Why don't you use it?
Dude, that was my biggest transition going to consulting, is saying like, look, I can do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, but you only need B. I'm only going to do B. You know what I mean? It's hard to not want to overachieve and deliver A, B, C, D because I can. I've got to only deliver what they're asking for, because otherwise my scope is I'm going to scope creep and not get it done in time. I'm going to deliver more than they even thought. And it's hard because like what you want to deliver is really what they want done. It's just either they don't have the budget, they're not mentally or organizationally ready to take on that kind of change. You know, like when we were making the changes you and I were making, they were changing comp, they were changing who reported to who, they were changing what metrics were used for paying people. Like, companies have to be ready to take those ideas on. If we're going to start identifying that the way we're paying people isn't correct, we've got to change it. You know, those are scary concepts for people sometimes. And surely you and I, looking at the data, can't know any better. We just looked at data, right? But my last role at the company you and I were at was a sales analytics strategist. I would give the salespeople commissions or I would give them their leads and I would calculate their commissions. It's the same job. I'm just looking at data. I'm just for sales instead of for call centers. But that's how you make sure that each person's getting a fair amount of leads and that they're actually returning and selling and all that stuff. Same stuff you're doing, just targeted somewhere else, right? You ever play with that side of the business? Like on the front end, on the business side of it? Or are you mostly still on the call center side?
I guess really on the call center side, especially with going to healthcare.
Yeah, totally fair. Just a total different perspective on the same data, right?
And it's so funny, like how the companies kind of interact and change. Like one of them, had acquired a nursing triage call center that another place I worked, that he'd actually done some of the like programming on the back end for them and stuff. And it was like funny, like, so I was able to say, oh yeah, so where I worked, had this, a company that used to be called this. And he's like, oh yeah, I remember there.
Huh.
Is that vague enough? I'm trying to be.
Yeah, dude, it's hard because this industry is really incestuous. Like the people all know each other. In the call center industry, dude, the owners all know each other, all that stuff. The workers all know each other.
I get people I've worked with multiple places and yep. And there's one I worked with that I helped get placed at another place that I worked with. I suggested, I just gave information.
And that's what's cool, right? They're not all terrible people. Like there's some people that I hope I never work with again. Luckily, the people I worked with, I didn't have anybody like that. But some of the companies we were trying to acquire and didn't, I'm really happy we didn't. But I mean, there's people too like that. Like I love catching up with you. I still talk with Sean. I still, reach out to people I used to work with at former company when we were there. But yeah, you build those friendships.
Oh yeah, I'm actually kind of surprised at people that I had friends with. Sorry, dog.
Who's a good boy? Who's a good boy? Yeah, I got a pit lab mix.
He's a pit something mix.
Yeah, you gotta love the mixes. Rescues?
Yep. We got him in November, and I don't think he's had an easy life. Yeah, we actually have him medicated. And we're working on training him, and I don't think I have. Yeah, so I have 2 young brindle pit bull mixes.
Oh, nice.
Totally different brindle.
Yeah, I've got the lab pit mix, and I've got not a beagle, but it's a kind of hound pit mix. But they're both, 4 and under, 4 and 5. My big one though is hips are going. I know Ryan, your dog's had problems with hips too. But we are a pupper-friendly podcast, that's for sure. Yeah,
we actually had a pit bull before that he was he died at about 6.5 years old. But broke our hearts. I didn't even know what a pit bull was before that. But he was the sweetest dog.
I was just telling Rob this morning, you mentioned yours is medicated. My Shiba Inu has been having seizures for the last couple of months. So we're looking at solving that problem here, hopefully this week. So I feel for the having to take care of your rescue baby.
Yeah.
So I think for the most part, we covered most of the questions. So Marisa, one of the things that we like to do here on the podcast is open it up to you for like 1 or 2 minutes, and you can tell everybody, all of our listeners out there, something that's important to you, whether it's where to find you, whether it's LinkedIn, Facebook, if you've got a website, your favorite charity you want people to donate to, or wherever you'd like people to go on the internet.
Sure. So my last project, like I said, wrapped up at the end of January. So I'm between projects right now, kind of looking for the next one. I'm interested in continuing, with consulting, as a subject matter expert, especially in like Imtelco or the one-call software. But, I'm open to learning other call center software, and I know that I could apply what I know to other platforms easily enough.
Best way to reach out to you, just look you up on LinkedIn, or how do you?
Yeah, look me up on LinkedIn. So Marisa and then Banes. And in my LinkedIn URL, I do have, that Marisa Banes in the URL, because you can actually customize that, which is nice. But at a base level, I know what I really want to do is, I really do like working with like the user interfaces and data. And I'm used to Microsoft SQL Server. I'd be totally open to like learning other stuff. It's just that the world I'm in, that's what it uses.
Isn't it like that sometimes, right? Like there's so many things I've wanted to learn and just like I want to do more with Power BI. I spent the last 4 years at companies that just use Tableau. It just is what it is. You don't get to choose that. You know what I mean? When a company decides we're going to make a $500,000 investment in one direction, you use the software they use. You don't tell them how you should use another tool. All right, good. Then we can put that link in the description too then, Ryan. Let's make sure we get that to her LinkedIn.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you're also welcome to join us in Discord too, Marisa. We do have, I don't know if you use Discord. It's kind of like a mix between a forum and a chat group. Just so you know, other things available to you.
Discord operates very much like a Slack server, except basically everybody is allowed there and can talk in most of the channels. So we're trying to build up that sort of more public-facing community on that side.
More two-way than just the podcast, right? The podcast is very one-way. It's nice to have somebody who can just download information from us, but like,
yeah,
you want to go back and forth. I want to help know what they're missing and give them the stuff they need. Well, thank you so much for your time today. We'll go ahead and close it out today. This is a fun little episode. I'm glad we got to catch up. It's been nice chatting with you.
Yes, definitely. It's definitely been fun and inspiring, motivating. And you can also check out your local animal shelter. I know mine offers, like you can go and walk the dogs, but there are different things that volunteer opportunities. You don't necessarily have to invest a whole lot of time in it. You don't have to bring the dogs home, especially ones like this one.
Huh.
You're going to bring the dogs home, though.
But what's cool is you can borrow the dogs and you can take them back. Yeah. You can foster them. You can take them on day trips.
I'll get your
buddy. You
buddy.
can adopt them and bring them home to drive you crazy.
He hears you talking about him.
Oh, but he's ready. You want to see a good picture of him?
Yeah, get a picture as a puppy.
Oh my gosh. Look at that pupper.
You can eat my fingers now. You can eat my hand. And he's
like, Mom, let's go for a walk.
He's a weird one. He's anxious. The other one loves walking now. But
Yep.
Really,
I'll jump off. But thank you so much again.
All right. Yep, thank you.
Yeah, it was a pleasure meeting you, pleasure talking with you, and I'm sure we'll be talking here again in the future.
All right. Thank you.
Take care.
Have a good weekend, Marisa.
You too.
Thank you for joining Podcast Like a Business on our journey to discover just how everything is data. If you want to watch the next episode or one of our favorites, click on the thumbnails here for more Podcast Lab and find us wherever you like to listen to podcasts.